What is enlightenment? My name is Michael Molina, and today I'm pleased to introduce veteran Kundalini researcher and activist Michael Bradford. Mike's webinar today will be addressing one of the most important questions, at least for me, which is, what is enlightenment? After the presentation, the notes will be available for download. Mike, really happy to have you here.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here, and I just want to thank the Emerging Sciences Foundation for this opportunity to do this presentation. And I hope everyone who's watching finds it informative and thought-provoking. A little bit of background about myself. Ever since I can remember, I've had an interest in the, I will call it, paranormal. In my mid-20s, I began the practice of meditation. In December 1977, I traveled to India with several other people. What was supposed to be a one-year stint as a volunteer worker, and this was for the Central Institute for Kundalini Research, founded and directed by Pandit Gopi Krishna, who is probably quite well known to many of you. 7 years later, I stepped off the plane from New Delhi at Toronto International Airport, not quite knowing which end was up, but feeling that I had been very much changed by the experience and feeling more or less like a different person almost. Shortly after, I joined an organization which was eventually to become the Institute for Consciousness Research, and my position there has been Director of Publications. My purpose was to keep Gopi Krishna's books in print, and more recently to convert his books into ebook format so that they're available on Amazon.com and Smashwords. So in India, when I was there in the early 1980s, I began studying astrology. And after I returned to Canada, I kept it up as a hobby. In the mid-1990s, I took it up as a more serious study, a more formal practice with Hart Defoe, a well-known Vedic astrologer from Toronto. In around 2002, I started seeing clients on a part-time basis, and since I retired from the IT consulting profession last year, I've been seeing clients on a full-time basis. So enough about me. What I'd like to do now is just give a brief outline of what I'd like to do or to present in this webinar. First of all, I would like to give a simple, clear, logical definition of what it means to be enlightened. Then I would like to talk a little bit about the mechanism in the physical body which brings about this state of mind. And then lastly, I would like to propose a set of physical and personality transformations which can be used as a general set of criteria for judging how far the process of spiritual transformation has gone. So, first order of business, a simple, easy to understand definition of enlightenment. Now, if every one of you listening here today was present in the room with me, and I would ask the question of each one of you, how would you define enlightenment? I have very little doubt that I would get exactly as many different answers as there are different people in the room. But there is a very simple way to consider enlightenment, and that is this. Enlightenment is a new faculty of perception beyond the intellect, which is the next step in human evolution. And I'll repeat that. Enlightenment is a new faculty of perception beyond the intellect, which is the next step in human evolution. Now, back several 100,000 years ago, when the human species evolved from whatever proto-human species that it came from, our intellect began to develop, I guess, as our brains grew larger in size. And over this time period, the intellect has continued to grow. And in the last 10,000 years or so, particularly, it has developed much more rapidly. The intellect is a very powerful tool. And in fact, it allows us to look into the past, to analyze the past, to project into the future and plan. It has given us conceptual tools like mathematics, science, and technology, which have given us a huge amount of insight into how the physical creation works. But the intellect has some limitations. Because it depends for its input upon our physical senses, it is not really in a position to detect or explore other possible realms of creation beyond the physical. So what I'm proposing is that those people whom we consider to be enlightened And that would be the founders of the major faiths, the great saints and mystics of the last several thousand years. That these people were, in fact, forerunners of the race to come. Now, probably it's safe to say that when the intellect began to evolve in us several 100,000 years ago, it didn't happen all at once. It probably started out in fits and starts in various individuals, and eventually it has become a feature of the entire race. Although, to be honest, when I see what some people do on reality TV shows these days, I don't know if that statement is entirely true. But I think you get my picture. In the same way, enlightenment will eventually become a feature of every member of the race. We will literally be born into a state of enlightenment. So the next question obviously arises, what is this new faculty of perception that is evolving in us? Now, to state that as simply as possible, this new faculty is the ability to directly perceive consciousness as the primary reality. And I'll repeat that. This new faculty of perception is the ability to directly perceive consciousness as the primary reality. Now, science, of course, does not view reality in this way. Science views consciousness as simply a byproduct of electrochemical activity in the neurons of the brain. No more, no less. And when we die, our consciousness is extinguished. It's gone. Now, there are a number of very compelling reasons why consciousness should be considered as the primary reality, but I don't have time, unfortunately, today to go into those as much as I would like to. For those of you who are interested, who would like to read more about this, there is an article that I wrote several years ago called The New Paradigm. It is currently available on the ICR website. That's the Institute for Consciousness Research website, icrcanada.org. And it currently is in the newsletter section, but probably it will move to the research article section in time. So each one of us has our own individual consciousness. And for most of us, if they're all the same as me, this consciousness is like a little bubble around our heads. When we look out at the physical universe, we see a creation so unimaginably vast that we cannot even begin to conceive of it. And our own little individual consciousness is almost totally insignificant in this vastness. Now, when this new faculty of mind starts to function, this little drop of consciousness that is our own individual one becomes aware or realizes that it is actually part of an ocean of infinite consciousness, awareness, and intelligence. And in the same way that a drop of water, say, from the Pacific Ocean is of exactly the same chemical constitution as the rest of the ocean that is not the ocean, our consciousness, our individual consciousness, is exactly the same in essence as the universal consciousness, but it is not the universal consciousness, for the simple reason that our consciousness is finite and the universal consciousness is infinite. So what is this mechanism then that produces this? Probably by now you've guessed that what I've been talking about is the mystical experience. Now, when I use the term mystical experience, I've noticed that it tends to bring out connotations of a dreamlike state, which is divorced from reality, totally subjective. This is absolutely not the case. The mystical perception is actually, it is described by people as being more solid than solid, more real than real. And going from the state of normal consciousness to the state of mystical consciousness is somewhat like going from the state of dreaming sleep to the state of wakefulness. When we're asleep and we're dreaming, then we suddenly wake up and we think, oh, I was asleep, but now I'm awake. I'm in the real world. In the same way, when we go to a state of mystical consciousness, it is like that, except much, much, much more intense. This impression of being now in what is the real world. So, what is this mechanism in the human body that brings about this transformation in our consciousness? Now, the Indian esoteric systems have been studying this mechanism in an unbroken fashion for at least 5,000 years. Probably much longer, but we simply don't have a historical record. And they have termed this mechanism in the human body Kundalini Shakti, in Sanskrit. Now, Shakti means creative power, and it has, in the same way that our consciousness has an individual aspect and a universal aspect, Shakti also has an individual aspect and a universal aspect. In its universal aspect, it is the power that brings the universe into creation. And in the individual aspect, it is the power in us as human beings which transforms our consciousness into the enlightened state. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with some of these ideas, or perhaps are of a more traditional scientific bent of mind, it really, to say that, oh, there is a mechanism in the human body, a new one that science has no knowledge of at all, and it suddenly starts to work and turns us into cosmic conscious sages, well, it's a bit of a stretch. I have to admit that. In fact, it's more than a bit of a stretch. However, before you grab your mouse and make a beeline for the little X in the upper corner of your screen, I would request that you bear with me for a little longer. Now, even though it is true to say that this mechanism has not been known to modern medical science, it has been known in the past in many different traditions and civilizations. And as an example of this knowledge, I would point to no less than the very symbol that the medical profession uses to represent itself, the very emblem of the medical profession. And this is, of course, the caduceus, known as the staff of Hermes, a very ancient Egyptian symbol. Now, in this symbol, we can see the central rod or staff of Hermes. This corresponds to the spinal cord. And the bulb at the top of the rod corresponds to the brain. And the two intertwined serpents are Kundalini Shakti. And in fact, in Sanskrit, Kundalini means entwined or coiled. And the wings of the figure are actually a representation of the release of the consciousness from the physical so that it can soar to other realms and perceive other aspects of creation. Now, I just wanted to say a little bit about the mechanism. I think you might have to go back a bit on the slides, Mike. As far as the Kundalini mechanism is concerned, it has two general areas of operation. Now, the first area of operation is in the brain, and it's not surprising because modern medical science has shown us in the last several decades that virtually every change that happens in the brain has a corresponding physical change every change that happens in our consciousness, our mind, has a corresponding physical change in the brain. Now, apparently, this seems to be a new activity in the brain, a new center or a part of the brain that comes to activity to give us this new view of reality. Now, if we were to take, say, a 100-watt light bulb and take it out of its socket and replace it with a 1,000-watt light bulb, it would necessarily require 10 times the amount of current to give us 10 times the amount of illumination. This is much the same situation as it is with the brain. In order for our brain to work at this much higher level of perception, it is necessary for it to have an enhanced source of power. Now, science recognizes only two things as being sources of power for the brain. One is oxygen, and the other is blood sugar. Now, every esoteric tradition that has been in existence throughout history has talked about another type of word. Energy comes to mind, but energy is not a good word to use because it has certain scientific connotations which don't apply here. I'm going to call it a vital essence in the body. And this vital essence is collected from the various tissues and organs of the body and is brought to the base of the spine by the nervous system. Here exists the other center of activity of the Kundalini mechanism, the center at the base of the spine. And here, this vital essence is transformed into a subtle, we call it a radiation. I'm going to refer to it as a psychic fuel from this point on. And the psychic fuel is sent up the brain, up the spinal cord rather, and into the brain, where it powers the brain so that this new faculty of perception can now be operative. So that is the general setup of the mechanism. Now, back to where I was before. I'm sort of skipping around a bit. probably, as I said before, it is a bit of a stretch to think of this new mechanism starting in the body. In fact, this mechanism is not new at all, and it has been active in a major way in every single individual in the human species. And it began at the time that we were a fertilized ovum in our mother's womb, and eventually it stopped at the time we were born. Now, in these 9 months, a single solitary cell divides, grows, multiplies, develops, differentiates, and it becomes eventually a living, thinking, breathing human being consisting of billions of cells of hundreds of different types, all working in a fashion which is nothing short of miraculous and working in near perfect harmony. And science really cannot explain how this process happens. Now, I used to think that it was the genetic code that controlled this process and directed it, until I started studying a little bit of microbiology. Although I make no claims to be have any formal qualifications in microbiology, I did find out some interesting things. The genetic code in human beings, there are about 20,000 what are called active genes. These genes are actually assembly instructions that are used to take amino acids and to manufacture the various elements that enable a cell to function. And these are things like proteins, enzymes, ribosomes, other things like that. The other is sort of the mechanics of a cell that allows it to function. Now, there can be no doubt whatsoever that the way in which our cells function determines virtually every aspect of our physical constitution and how it behaves, our health and everything else. However, I could not find anywhere any reference to any set of instructions for how to assemble a human being in the womb. There just didn't seem to be anything. Now, if anyone knows any different, then please let me know. I would love to be corrected. But as far as I can tell, there are no instructions for how this process goes on. And this process that happens in the womb is so amazing, so complex, so dynamic, that there is literally nothing in the history of human civilization that even begins to remotely rival this process. And so I would say to those of you who are perhaps a little skeptical of these ideas, that they're a little bit strange or different or not too familiar, that until science can explain what happens in the womb, how we grow in the womb, that it would be good to keep an open mind to ideas like Kundalini Shakti, which are perhaps a little bit different than what we are used to. So there are two other things I would like to mention before I go on to the next section. And one is that obviously everyone who has a mystical experience does not become an enlightened person. And this is for the simple reason that the energy required to sustain this state of mind cannot be sustained by the body for more than a short period of time. Moments, hours, maybe even days in some cases. But eventually, in the vast majority of cases, we come back to a more or less normal state of consciousness. Now, this state is not that we are unchanged. In fact, as I will describe later, anyone who has this experience will be changed in a very, very powerful way to the roots of their being. But they still return to pretty much a normal state of consciousness. And it is only in the case of the Enlightened that the Kundalini mechanism actually transforms the entire body, all the organs and tissues, so that it can provide this vital essence to the center at the base of the spine to power this new faculty of perception in the brain. The last point that I would like to make about this process is that it seems to proceed in two different modes of functioning. One I will call the dramatic mode of functioning, where the person going through the process, they're aware of flows of energy in the body, of heat, all sorts of sensations, rapid changes in their consciousness. And this is usually a consequence of someone who has done intensive spiritual practices, although not always. It can sometimes happen spontaneously. The other mode of transformation is the slow and gradual mode, which is usually a consequence of lighter forms of spiritual discipline, coupled with a lifestyle which is in harmony with what the Kundalini mechanism is trying to accomplish in the body. In this case, we don't perceive all sorts of flows of energy and things like that. And as a consequence, it has led a number of people that I have met to say that, oh, Kundalini is only one way that spiritual transformation can happen. But if we think of the Kundalini mechanism as consisting of both the center at the base of the spine and the center in the brain, then it becomes plainly obvious that this cannot be the case, because any transformation of our mental state must have a corresponding physical transformation. So now I would like to go on to the next section, which is a brief review of some of the characteristics of mystical perception or the mystical experience. These are definitely not all that can be discussed, but time only permits me to do the most important ones. Now, the first characteristic of a mystical experience is perception of light and sound. And I would like to refer here to a quote or an account from a gentleman named Dr. Richard Morris Buck. He was a Canadian psychiatrist who lived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he was in London, England, on a visit at one point, and he had been attending, I guess, a poetry reading, as he said. And he was traveling back to his lodgings in a horse-drawn carriage in a very calm, meditative state of mind. And then he said that all of a sudden, it seemed like he was wrapped around like a flame, with a flame-colored cloud. Now, at first, he thought that the entire city was on fire. And after a moment, he realized that this light was within himself. And it's a very moving account, and he later goes on to describe both of the other major characteristics I'm going to talk about in a minute. And in fact, this perception of light is the very reason why saints and mystics are shown, depictions of them are shown with halos of light around their head, like a bulb of light or a circle around the top of the head. This is actually indicating the perception of inner light that they have. Now, as far as the sounds go, Gopi Krishna described in his initial mystical experience in 1937, he said he described it as a roar like a waterfall that entered his brain in a stream of liquid light from the spinal cord. In a later experience, he described it as having evolved into a sound like the humming of love-mad bees. But in both cases, the light and the sound, this is almost universally a characteristic of a mystical experience. The next characteristic of mystical experience is the unity of the individual consciousness with the universal consciousness. And this, as can be imagined, is a totally overwhelming sight beyond description. And as Gopi Krishna said at one time, and probably I think he said it on a number of occasions, he said, "When I perceive this consciousness, I am humbled to dust. It is so vast." And there are many accounts of mystics who describe this, but what you will find is if you read these accounts, they will put it into a context that is something that their intellect can understand. Probably because the intellect cannot entertain the infinite. Say for a Christian who has the experience, they will say, "Oh, I had an encounter, I saw God." A Muslim may say, "Oh, I had an encounter with Allah." Or a Hindu may say, "I had darshan with Krishna." In each one of these cases, the intellect is interpreting the experience in a way that makes sense to it. But it is, in essence, the same experience. Now, the last characteristic of a mystical experience I'm going to touch on is the bliss or ecstasy that is experienced in this state. Now, those who have described it say that there is nothing in the physical that can compare to this. The only thing that can even begin to compare is the pleasure experienced during sex. But the mystical ecstasy, the mystical bliss, is, according to people who have had the experience, much more refined and much, much, much more intense, if you can wrap your mind around that. And, there have been very many mystics and saints who have described this experience. And not surprisingly, between the light and sound, the unity in the mystical consciousness, and the bliss and ecstasy, there comes an emotional release. And this was described very aptly by Gopi Krishna in a conference in India in the mid-1970s. And he was asked by someone in the audience to describe the experience that he had. And he said, really, there are no words that can describe this experience. So there are only two responses that can begin to convey the depth and profundity of the experience. He said one is silence and the other is tears. And with that, I will go on to our next section. And this is a little bit more of a description of the mechanism in the physical body that brings about this state of enlightenment. Now, earlier I described a center in the brain, and in Sanskrit this is referred to as Brahma Randra. And Randra, well, first of all, Brahma, as many of you are probably familiar with, is the creator deity of the Hindu Trinity. And it is called, the center is referred to as being like Brahma because we become aware of new aspects of creation that we did not know before. Randra is, in translation from Sanskrit, actually means a chamber. And this is very significant because it tends to indicate that, as some people believe, we are not talking here about the pineal gland or the pituitary gland alone, although they are probably involved in the process, but an entire center inside the brain, a major part of the brain coming to activity. The center at the base of the spine in Sanskrit is called Muladhara Chakra, which translates as the root support center. And when the center in the brain opens up, as a consequence of meditation, usually, the center in the brain is stimulated by meditation or focused concentration. The center at the base of the spine is stimulated in yoga by the practice of pranayama, or breathing exercises. When the center in the brain becomes active, it immediately requires a psychic fuel, a level of psychic fuel, in order to sustain that new faculty of perception. Now, in order to provide this fuel, the center at the base of the spine will take this vital essence from the most potent source in the body that it can find. And this is in the reproductive fluids of both men and women. And this is the main reason why celibacy or continence has been prescribed in many spiritual traditions. If the center in the brain opens up, but the body cannot supply the required amount of energy, it can, in some cases, lead to extreme mental distress, to neuroses, transient psychoses, various compulsive disorders, and things like that. So it is imperative that the body be able to provide this energy in the form that it needs when this happens. And over time, in the case of those people who actually become enlightened, that small group, what happens is the body, the Kundalini mechanism actually transforms the various tissues and organs of the body so that it can provide this vital essence in a quantity that can supply the brain without the stress on the reproductive system. But it is very important that during the process of transformation that this need of the brain be respected. The last thing I would like to talk about are what might call the sensory transformations of the experience. And Gopi Krishna has described these in some detail, and I will just refer to his experience because it seems to be the best one available. After he had his initial mystical experience in 1937, he did not return to a normal state of consciousness. The way he described it was the conscious bubble around his head was much larger. He said that it had a greater surface area. That's the term that he used. In addition to that, he found that his visual faculty, his vision had changed. And he said that everything he looked at seemed to be covered with a very fine layer of chalk dust. Now, it didn't impair his vision in any way, but it was just there. It was there in everything that he looked at. And this distinct change in his vision went on unchanged for a number of years. I'm not sure how many, but it was quite a few years, maybe 8 or 10 years. Then one day, while he was at lunch at work, he was out walking around the government buildings where he had his office, and he happened to look up at the facade of one of the buildings. And he suddenly noticed, to his astonishment, that this layer of chalk dust had transformed into a ravishingly beautiful silvery golden luster. And this mode of perception, this change in his visual faculty, went on till the day he died. And similar was the case with his auditory perception. He said that sounds over time sounds became much more melodious and beautiful and enrapturing. So these are the transformations in the auditory and visual faculties. And he said that they even extended into his dreams. He described his dreams as being like an Elysium of beauty and bliss and joy, and they're just indescribable. So this is some of the physical transformations that happen when a person goes to what I would call a state of full enlightenment. Now, the last thing that I would like to talk about is the personality transformations that happen to someone who goes through this experience. Now, most of these transformations apply only to what I would say is someone who is more or less enlightened, but some of them apply to people who only have one mystical experience, or two, or a few of them. Now, the first major feature of the transformation in terms of personality is revelation, the revelation of new knowledge. And at the very least, the person should be able to describe their experience in a totally unique and convincing way. But revelation in ancient times was regarded as the hallmark of enlightenment. Now, many people have what I would call flashes of inspiration. I even had the odd one myself. But there is a major difference between revelation and inspiration. In the case of inspiration, the knowledge that comes into our mind, we don't have any real idea where it comes from. It just comes into our mind. But in terms of inspiration, in terms of revelation, we are directly aware of the intelligence from which this new knowledge comes. And in Gopi Krishna's case, it was when he wrote books of poetry. He has 3 full books of poetry, and I happened to be living in India when he wrote one of them, working with him, and it just poured out of him. Perfectly rhymed and metered. In the space of maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks, he wrote an entire book of poetry. And as you can see from the picture, Buddha teaching, his disciples that this is considered the hallmark of enlightenment. The next item of transformation is moral elevation. And these are the qualities that we normally associate with saintliness, compassion, charity, things like that. And in particular, these people will feel almost compelled to do something in the service of mankind, to help other people directly. This is one of the primary characteristics of this experience, is this elevation of the morals. And something that if you don't see in a person, then you have to question whether they are really enlightened or not. The next characteristic is a sense of detachment from the physical world. And by this I mean that the person will not have any desire for power, wealth, fame, fortune, or anything like that. And we have many examples in history of saints who basically renounced the world. They decided that they wished to devote themselves to helping others, or even just to the internal process. The founders of the major faiths were interesting because they were actually masters of both worlds, the inner and the outer. They were very capable in both ways. But this detachment from the world is a very important aspect of this process. The next one that I would refer to is the reduction in ego or pride, coupled with a childlike nature. And here I would like to recount one of the experiences of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, who was an Indian mystic who lived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And one story recounts that Ramakrishna would sometimes sit with his followers, and it became known that he liked sweets. So one day, someone brought him a dish of sweets, which he very much liked. And shortly after he was given the dish of sweets, he felt one of his mystical trances coming on. Now, in order to prevent the sweets from disappearing while he was in his mystical trance, he reached out with his hand and covered up the dish. So this is an example of the childlike nature. And in fact, as it says in the Bible, unless you become like little children, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. This is a very common feature of those who are in this perennial state, a childlike nature. The next characteristic I'd like to talk about is the development of new talents and abilities, even traits of genius that were not present before the experiences. And these can be of many different kinds. They can be, as I mentioned before, inspired verse. They can be an art of any kind, painting, sculpture, music, languages, medicine, even math and science. And in Gopi Krishna's case, he remarked that at one time in his life, he began to write poetry in languages that he had no knowledge of whatsoever. He'd never heard them spoken, he'd never seen them written. And these are actually published in a book distributed by ICR called From the Unseen. And he said that at that time, if he had not had other obligations like work and family, if he had been able to devote his full attention to the process during that time, in the space of several months, he could have learned maybe a dozen world languages. Now, another example of this is Hildegard of Bingen, a saint who lived in, I believe, the 13th century in Europe. And after the transformation she went through, she became a multi-dimensional genius in a number of different areas. She became a master of medicine, and she even wrote music, which is still being performed to this day. So virtually everyone, even though they may not become an enlightened sage, everyone who goes through this process of transformation will, in some way, shape, or form, display an ability or talent that they did not have before. So going on to the last couple of items, I'll just touch on them briefly. One of the characteristics, which is a certainty for those who have had the experience, is that they no longer have any fear of death. And this is not a belief that they have no fear of death. It is actually the knowledge that there is no such thing as death, because they have experienced that the drop of individual consciousness in them is actually a part of this universal consciousness, which is infinite and undying. So they have this deep knowledge that this what we call death is simply the destruction of the physical body, and our consciousness continues on afterwards. Another aspect of this transformation is the development of psychic abilities. And these can be in virtually any form. They can be clairaudience, clairvoyance, clairsentience, prophetic dreams, remote viewing, virtually anything. And I'd just like to point out, though, that it's not the case that people with who develop these abilities or have these abilities are necessarily in any way, shape, or form enlightened. And it all has to do with the brain and how the brain functions and the areas of the brain that become activated in this process. So you could have a situation where the areas of the brain having to do with psychic abilities become active, but all the rest of the brain does not. So the person may not evince any of the other characteristics in any major way. But I would also like to point out that virtually every spiritual tradition has encouraged people to not have any desire to pursue these various psychic abilities. And as I mentioned earlier, people who become enlightened will have a sense of detachment, and included in wealth, fame, power, and things like that are psychic abilities. They say, well, you acknowledge them, you can make use of them if they're helpful, and you can depend on them, but don't have any desire to have more of them or to become involved in them. The last characteristic that I'd like to mention is a charisma that develops in these people. And we have seen it many, many times in the past, that those people who have this experience, people will flock to them in hordes and droves. Followers will come to them. Even though they will not want to have the followers will be there. And this personal charisma is very much a part of the experience, and is another aspect of it. Now, finally, what I'd like to do is to just quickly look at one of the most amazing pieces of art in India that has ever been done, and it'll probably be familiar to most of you. And this is called the Nataraj, or Dancing Shiva. Now, this piece of art has a number of details to it, which I'll go over, and every one of them has something to do with this transformation. First of all, you can see the circle around the outside of the figure. This circle tends to represent infinity, and of course it refers to the unification of our individual consciousness with the universal consciousness. In the figure's two upper arms, in the hands of the upper arms, there is a tiny drum and a tiny flame, and these refer to the light and sound, which I mentioned under the characteristics of a mystical experience. Inner light and sound, and very important. In fact, there was one treatise on Kundalini. The very first statement of this treatise is, Kundalini is of the nature of light and sound. If you look at the lower hands, you will see that I believe it's the right arm is facing palm outwards. This is a mudra, or a gesture, and in fact a universal gesture, indicating lack of fear, like you have no fear. And in fact, you will even see this in old movies where one group of people comes up to another and they want to convey the fact that the other group should have no fear of them. They will put their palm outwards in this gesture. In this case, it means that the individual who has had this transformation has no fear of death. There is no fear of death. And the last, or not the second last, I should say it is the last attribute of the artwork, is the other hand is pointing to this little tiny figure being crushed underfoot. And also, as I should have mentioned, the other characteristic of the figure is that it is in an ecstatic dance of joy and bliss, and this corresponds to this characteristic, as I mentioned, that during this experience there is this intense bliss. But the little man being crushed underfoot is the ego. And as I mentioned earlier, the person will experience a reduction in ego and pride. And it is sometimes referred to as the person of forgetfulness and misunderstanding, who has forgotten its divine essence and becomes totally enmeshed in the material world. So with that, I'd like to conclude the webinar and turn it back over to Mike for any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for presenting this material. I think you brought up a lot of points that may have been unclear to a lot of people, and it's pretty comprehensive coverage of this phenomenon of enlightenment. What I'd like to do is actually take the next few minutes to ask the audience if they'd like to ask questions. So if you want to ask any questions, what you'll want to do is on your Google Hangouts window, there's going to be 9 little dots up at the upper right-hand side of the screen. And if you click on that and go to the QA button there, you'll be able to type in your questions. But Mike, I actually have a couple of questions for you. The first one is that, we've heard from a lot of people, and there's a lot of accounts out there of people either taking acid or different types of drugs and having these types of mystical or spiritual types of experiences. What is the big difference, I guess, between someone who's having a drug experience? It could be a lot of bliss, a lot of ecstasy in this state, versus what you're describing here as enlightenment.
That's a very interesting question, Mike. First of all, I would like to point out that there is a qualitative difference in the experience between those who take drugs and those who have a mystical experience. In the mystical experience, people will come back from this and they will make statements like, I was transformed to the roots of my being, or I have all this knowledge that I never had before. Gopi Krishna said at one time in the description of one of his mystical experience, he said, I learned a lifetime of knowledge in the space of a few minutes. It was that intense. You do not hear these kind of descriptions from people having drug experiences. They may say something like, well, I had this incredible insight, but gosh, I can't remember what it was now, or it doesn't seem to make sense to me now that I'm back in my normal state of mind. So there is a true qualitative difference between drug experiences and a mystical experience. The knowledge, the transformation, it just doesn't seem to happen. Now, I have known of cases where a mystical experience was triggered by a drug experience. And what I would like to point out is that this has to do with the parts of the brain that become activated. And there are various parts of the brain which modern science is now revealing that seem to bring about states of mind akin to those in mystical perception. I know there is one research that is being done that there is a sense of presence that, with a certain type of electrical or magnetic stimulation, the brain seems to have this sense of a presence around it. So obviously there are areas of the brain that are being stimulated by drugs when we take them. So there may be some characteristics of a drug experience which are in some ways somewhat similar to a mystical experience, but the difference between the brain being powered by a foreign chemical and the brain being powered by a psychic fuel produced by the body is radically different. It is a totally different experience. So again, I would also like to point out that I don't know of any spiritual tradition that's taken seriously that prescribes drugs as a means of achieving enlightenment. It just doesn't seem to be the case. So I hope that's answered the question to your satisfaction.
Yeah, that's really good to clarify that point, Mike. I think there's a lot of confusion out there, especially today, between what you would gain out of, let's say, traditional spiritual practices and living a balanced moral life versus, taking drugs to achieve some of these states. We have a quick question also from JJ Semple. He's just asking, will a transcript be available? JJ, the meeting notes or the slides basically will be available on the website after the webinar. So those will be available for downloads. All the major points will be there. And we were discussing also having, let's say, something of like a transcript to get this video in multiple languages. So that's another thing to take into consideration also.
Now, I just want to point out that JJ has been encouraging me to write a book. Maybe when the book comes out, if that ever happens, then you'll be able to get most of what I talked about at that time. Let's hope it happens.
We're crossing our fingers, Mike. I do have another question, Mike, and that is, from what you pointed out in your webinar, and I was just looking at the individuals who are having these types of experiences, these spiritual mystical experiences, it seems like there are more men than women happening to whom this experience is happening. And I wonder if that's, if you can maybe shed some light on that.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Mike, and I think it has troubled a lot of people. I guess I should answer that in two stages, or two steps. The first thing that I'll address is, from the point of view of the Kundalini mechanism, is it the case that men or women are more spiritual than the other? Now, this is one of the beauties of this whole way of looking at the process, is that the answer is actually quite simple and quite clear. If you consider this transformation as being the next step in human evolution, and you consider the fact that both females and males contribute 50% of their DNA to both female and male children, how could it possibly be the case that one half of the human race could evolve at a different rate of speed than the other half? It is essentially, it's not even a question. Interestingly enough, I would also like to point out that I think this, I'm not sure whether this is one of Gopi Krishna's talks or in a private conversation, he actually pointed out that if you'll recall my description of what happens in the womb when we are being basically constructed or built by this Kundalini Shakti, he said that given the fact that women are actually equipped with this mechanism to create new human beings, where Kundalini is extremely highly active, it may be the case that they will find it easier to to have this process of transformation restart later in life. It was just a conjecture on his part, but in a way, I kind of like it. It sort of turns the tables a little bit that way. The other thing that I would like to point out is that in the last several thousand years, the vast majority of cultures and civilizations have been male-dominated. We have a male god in Christianity. Literally, most of these cultures were not only male-dominated, but most cultures in the past were highly role-oriented. In other words, males and females had particular roles that they were expected to adhere to, and it was frowned upon if there was any deviation from those roles. And I think that in the case of women who had major transformation experiences, they were generally told to keep it to themselves. They were not listened to if they tried to tell people what happened. And this is the main reason why these experiences are mostly, the accounts that we have of these experiences come mostly from men. But there are certainly many, many women mystics, Laleshwari in Kashmir, Hildegard of Bingen, St. Teresa, St. Catherine. Many, many women have had these experiences, and I think it's safe to say that from the evolutionary standpoint, we each have an equal opportunity.
Well, thank you, Mike. That helps clarify that. You know, I think it may be a common misconception if you look historically that you know, it's male dominated, but I think that may be more based on you know, the fact that we do live in this sort of male-oriented society, and I could see things changing, you know, for the better if we were to balance things out a bit.
I hope so.
So I have a statement that I'm going to sort of phrase as a question. This is Nick S. And the comment that he made has me asking the question, you know, when people are having these mystical or spiritual experiences, you know, some may say that it's an experience of universal consciousness, others may say that it's an experience of the human collective consciousness. From your experience, Mike, when you have these experiences, what is it that you are coming in touch with?
Well, I would say that as far as the collective human consciousness, this is actually something Gopi Krishna referred to many times in his writings. The way he described it is that every individual species has what he calls a pranic spectrum. In other words, a spectrum of prana, which determines how that species functions and operates. And I actually have just completed an article, which is in the current and past previous ICR newsletters, entitled Prana and Kundalini, Aspects of Shakti. And in this I'm discussing some of the ways in which this energy functions at the cellular level. But he also described this pranic spectrum not only being at the individual level, but also at the level of the whole species. So each species has their own spectrum of prana. Each individual has a subset of that prana that is slightly different from it. So I would say, in all likelihood, that the whole creation is filled with these various pranic spectrums, or aspects of consciousness, you might call them, subsets of consciousness that are differentiated in the physical realm by being different species. I'm not sure how else to answer that question beyond that, but certainly it is a very interesting question.
Well, thank you, Mike. We've got about 5 minutes till the top of the hour. I don't see any more questions coming through, so with that, I think that'll be the last question. And again, Mike, thank you for joining us today and presenting all of this extremely important material. For those who are watching the video, who have not done already, I would encourage you, if this webinar interests you and you'd like to see more like it, to sign up for our mailing list on the Emerging Sciences website, emergingsciences.org, or join Brilliano.com to learn more about what we're doing and to join this cause. So I'd like to thank everybody in attendance, and again, Mike, especially you for presenting.
Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.